Welcome to week 7, everybody. Had some great conversations this week as we started to get into Paul's letters, which have such a problematic legacy among many of us. And I think we're creating some space perhaps to hear the voice of these letters as we haven't heard it before, partly by starting with Philemon, which is such a pastoral letter in so many ways. And I hope that just paying attention to the specific pastoral purposes of Paul's letters is going to help us interpret them better, perhaps have a healthier sense of the voice of these letters. It's challenging, as I think we already began to see, to identify what I have said is so important, which is the rhetorical purpose that Paul has at a particular stage in the argument of a letter. There's something specific that he's driving at, something that he's trying to get across. And if we lose sight of that, then we start to assume all kinds of things that Paul is supposedly trying to correct or address. And that's where I think we can produce some really questionable and sometimes harmful readings of Paul's letters. It was a challenge this past week to get at what the rhetorical purpose might be of a paragraph in Paul's letters at a particular stage in a small letter like Philippians. Our challenge in this coming week is that now we're going to try to track the thread of a letter's argument through a much longer epistle like 1 Corinthians and then 2 Corinthians. And letters that are longer like that make it easier for us to kind of lose our way, lose track of what Paul is getting at, what his particular concern might be at a specific stage. So we're going to be working really hard to do that in 1st and 2nd Corinthians across these longer letters. Now, with that, as will become clear in 1 Corinthians, is the need of allowing the letter to inform our sense of what Paul is addressing. Paul is never writing to a vacuum. There are always specific challenges in the community that he's addressing. Pastoral challenges. We could call them political challenges as well. But the point is that we've got to have a sense of what those challenges are to have a good interpretation of what he's saying. And the letter itself is really our best source for making sense of what those challenges are. In 1 Corinthians, we're going to learn early in the letter about a very specific problem of factions, certain kind of rivalry that is loose in the community that Paul's writing to in Corinth. So that what Paul has to say about the cross and how the cross means what it means is in response to that specific pastoral challenge. And we want to allow that to sort of constrain in a good way our imagination of what Paul is arguing and the purpose that he has at a particular stage of what he's writing. So look for that issue as well. Paying attention to the letter for evidence of what the specific challenges that Paul's addressing, and then using that to guide our interpretation of what Paul has to say. Along the way, of course, Paul is going to be using some really kind of dense, epic, we might say, theological language, making some far-reaching theological claims. And this is going to invite us to reflect very broadly on certain theological questions, and that's okay. We just don't want to lose sight of the fact that, what's up, Jude? We don't want to lose sight of the fact that those broad theological questions are not themselves the most immediate subject of the letter. Instead, they're questions that are raised by the theological claims that Paul makes for very local and specific purposes. So we just want to allow the letter to be an occasion for wider theological reflection, but not lose sight of what the definite pastoral concern is with that question. And that's going to then act, I think, as a healthy sort of discipline on our theological development. So often when Paul has been read as just kind of a flat theological source book for general theological doctrine or something like that, we end up with really distorted views, I think, of the theology that drives his letters, because we've lost sight of the specific pastoral purposes that his theological claims are serving. And so that's something that we want to try to work on, and I hope draw, as a result, a kind of theological sensibility that is going to be a little more nuanced, a little more nimble, not quite so captive to certain abstractions that don't have any kind of concrete anchor. And that's going to be significant, I hope, for those of you who are training as psychologists, because your own sensibilities as a Christian, I think, will be richer, more subtle for the purposes of therapy, but also wider purposes in your life, if your theological language, vocabulary, sensibility has been shaped by this kind of mode of theological communication. That is a mode that is letters written to specific communities of people with very specific problems that Paul, yes, mobilizes some far-reaching theology for, but in the service of those specific challenges. So that's going to be a focus for this week. You should have received your book reviews of Shadow of the Galilean back. Those, on the whole, as a class, were just fantastic. So keep up the good work. We'll be finishing grading your working papers this week, and so you should be receiving those. But I wanted to make sure that you had your first book review back so that you could take that feedback into account as you begin to think about your next book review, which is not due this week. It's not due till the end of next week. But that feedback hopefully will be helpful to you as you start to think about that. The question of your first book review about the contribution of the study of historical context to the interpretation of the Gospels is now going to expand a little bit as we read this book, Seized by Truth, by my colleague Joel Green, where we're going to be wrestling with questions of how understanding the Bible as scripture, as a collected canon of literature that has been shaped by community processes through time, how that affects the way we interpret it. And I think a lot of us in the conversations we've been having in class have already sort of raised questions along these lines. So I'm glad that this book is going to give you a chance to process a little bit more on that kind of a question, what it means to read the Bible, not just as a collection of random documents that were assembled with no sort of particular process at work, but instead a collection that is the consequence of an intergenerational community of people discerning how God has been at work among them. So looking forward to getting into those questions a little deeper as we read Seized by Truth by Joel Green. Hope you have a great week 7. Looking forward to the conversations in the forums, the video discussion groups, and I will see you in those settings. Have a great week.
Bye. Dad?
Yeah.
Can I go bike?